Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. We're watching Austin transform from a thriving ecosystem into a global superstar. With our host, Jason Scharf, we aspire to better comprehend the true nature of innovation. Together, we will uncover what makes a successful ecosystem and navigate the technologies shaping our future. Now let's dive into what's next.
Are venture investors lucky or good? It's a question that haunts even the great ones, and it's what sparked the journey of my next guest, Mike Maples Jr., to write his new book, Pattern Breakers, where he tries to figure out why the seemingly promising startups doing everything right fail, while those doing many of the supposed wrong things achieve massive success. And is there something profound happening underneath it all? Mike is an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, podcaster, and the co-founder of Floodgate, a leading seed stage fund in Silicon Valley that invested in companies like X when it was Twitter, Twitch, Okta, and Applied Intuition at the very beginning of their startup journeys. He is an 8-time member of the Forbes Midas list and is one of the pioneers of the seed investing movement. Entrepreneurs consider Mike more of a co-conspirator than an investor because he likes to be the first to believe in the radically different futures they pursue. He is the host of the top-rated podcast, Pattern Breakers. Mike received his MBA from Harvard Business School while receiving his BS in engineering from Stanford University. Outside of startups, Mike is a professional calligrapher and works with causes like Operation Hope, a nonprofit organization focused on providing financial literacy and opportunity for all. I really enjoyed his book, and whether you're a founder, investor, innovator, or just trying to make sense of all the tech waves we're riding, I think you'll find something interesting in my conversation with Mike. Mike, welcome to the Austin Next podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure.
I'm really excited about this and really excited to talk with you about your new book, Pattern Breakers, and just venture and startup in general.
Yeah, me too. It's one of my favorite subjects.
So I kind of want to start off in the big picture. Why write the book at all? And why even share the secrets of what makes, good investing and how to pick pattern breakers?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I kind of had an unsettling realization. And so I was involved with a company called Twitch that was acquired for $970 million, and we made 84 times our money. And the unsettling part of it was that I had forgotten I was a shareholder in Twitch. And so I had invested in a company called Justin TV, and it morphed into two companies, Social Cam and Twitch. And Social Cam was acquired by Autodesk for $65 million. And I thought that was just the company. So imagine how embarrassing this is. You go to your limited partners, your investors, and you say, "Hey, I'm really sorry. There's a company, I don't even have it in our financials. I need to restate my financials, but it's this big windfall. We made 84 times our money." And all of them were like, "No, we're good. Just send us the money. Don't need to restate anything." In fact, one of my LPs sent me a pretty fancy bottle of champagne and stuff like that. But then a couple of other things. I'd noticed that the prior fall, so this was the summer of 2014, the prior fall, Twitter and Chegg had gone public within a week of each other. And I'd seed funded those two companies, but they had also been massive pivots. Twitter started as a podcasting company. And then they wanted to try to decide whether to call it TWTTR or Voicemail 2.0. And I like to say that I bought two vowels. And then Elon took them all away by renaming it X. And then Chegg started as a classified site for colleges. And so I kind of zoomed out and I was like, 80+% of my exit profits have come from pivots. And right around that time, Lyft had just pivoted from Zimride to Lyft, and it was starting to blow up, and ride sharing was blowing up. And, at the same time, a lot of startups I was working with, and this might resonate with some of your listeners, a lot of them seemed to do the best practices that you're supposed to do. They did the business model canvas. They did they would have been a Harvard Business School case study of what to do, except for the fact that they failed. And so I just noticed it time and again that here you had Twitter that didn't do any best practices that I could discern. They couldn't decide who the CEO was. The fail whale was there all the time. In the early days, it was pretty messy. And, the Justin TV guys, famously brag about how dysfunctional they were as a management team. And so I was like, okay, what if this is all just random? And am I just a lucky fool? Like in Fool by Randomness by Nassim Taleb, he describes a character called the Lucky Fool who attributes his success to something that he knew about or some vision that he had, but really was just lucky and isn't willing to come to grips with the fact that they've been lucky. And so I thought, I either need to figure out if this is total luck, and I should retire before I get exposed, or there's something else here to understand that's worth understanding. And so that was kind of the genesis of the book. Was I went down this 3 or 4 year rabbit hole of trying to figure out this question.
And so before we, I think, dive into inflection theory itself and what you discovered, I'm going to say that if the biggest wins happened from the pivot, then is there something that you actually can be looking for? Because can you even assess the ideas that they're coming, because they're going to go left versus right later on? That's where the big win's going to come from. Or is it all about assessing the person?
Yeah. I mean, Jason, that's what I was really grappling with, right? Because like, how do let's say that you come to this realization that when you're successful 80% of the time, the product changes. That's in the success case. So that it's like, what are you investing in then?
Right.
Are you invested in the product? Because it seems like maybe not. And so that's exactly right. And yes, it does. The person matters tremendously, for sure. But what I came to realize, and what I ended up calling inflection theory, was that there are forces behind some ideas that give them more potential upside than other ideas. Some ideas embody a set of powers that just give them more of an advantage to changing the future. And even if you don't know if you've converged on the exact right implementation, it's still oftentimes worth pursuing. And so what I discovered, I put it this way: some ideas that seem dumb are worth pursuing. Like Justin TV was a dumb idea, right? Justin Kahn live casting his life online 24/7 is a terrible idea, but it embodied some things that we can talk about that made it a good opportunity to pursue. There are other ideas that sound plausibly good that aren't that good. So like an example from the past is like fan base, social network for sports fans.
Mm-hmm.
Those ideas are the most dangerous because you talk to 5 friends and they all say, social network, sports fans, that sounds reasonable. But the problem is there's 0 desperate people for that. And so you end up having a failed startup. And so you want to protect the ideas that sound bad, but that are actually good. Air, Bed, and Breakfast, Justin TV, Zimride. But you want to avoid pursuing ideas that sound plausibly good that aren't that good, and that you lose your time. You're 3 years in wishing you hadn't started it, but now you're stuck because you have employees and investors, and you can't just leave. And so that's really what the book was about, was to help founders assess, stress test their ideas to decide which ones were most worthy of their time and talent.
I know we're jumping ahead, I think, in the framework, but then are we thinking about things always in and I know I'm going to like butcher the quote from like Steve Jobs, where it's, you don't ask people what they want. You kind of have to tell them what it's the whole, like if you ask people what they wanted for cars, they would have said, I want a faster horse. Because you said the same thing with a plausible idea. 5 people are like, of course that sounds good. So how do you test the ideas if nobody knows they actually want Airbnb or...
Yeah. And so that's kind of where the inflection theory ideas started to take shape. And so basically, here's what I concluded. Business is never a fair fight. The only question is who gets to fight unfair. And in the default position, the incumbents fight unfair. The present fights unfair. And so what most people don't realize, and what I came to understand, is that a startup capitalist is a different kind of capitalist. A corporate capitalist makes money and creates value in a different way. They create value in the way that Warren Buffett would describe value creation. They create defensible moats. They create economies of scale. They have network effects. They have brand. They have process power. They have, forces that contribute to benefits for their profits and barriers for competitors. Well, what I came to realize is startup has none of those things. And so how does a startup capitalist create value? They create value by changing the subject. They create value by denying the premise of the rules. And so what the mistake that a lot of startups were making, and I'm sympathetic to it, is they would hear the advice that, if you don't have a big market, you're going to fail. It doesn't matter if you invent a good widget. If you don't have a good market, you're going to fail. So you should go after big markets. So what they'll do is they'll assess markets. They'll try to find a big market that has white space, that has unserved needs of unserved customers in underserved markets, and then go try to build a product that addresses that unmet need. But there's a problem, and it's subtle, but it's important. When you do that, you're buying into a context, which is the rules of the market are governed as they've already been defined. And so you're buying into the premise of the rules and trying to find a gap that exists on the playing field within the rules as they've been defined. And what a great startup does is it avoids the comparison trap entirely. So like when you took a Lyft ride for the first time, nobody in San Francisco ever said, well, so how does that compare to taxis?
Right.
And so like I like to say that a great startup idea forces a choice and not a comparison. Like if everybody's selling apples, you're not a 10 times better apple. You say, I'm the world's first banana. And you may not want my banana, which is fine, but I need to find all the people in the world who value the advantage of bananas because I'm the only guy that has them. And so I should be able to, command a premium and do really well. So the inflection theory starts, therefore, with inflections. And inflections are the empowering force that allows founders to change the rules. It's kind of like the Rock and David's slingshot against Goliath. And so we need to start with inflections to provide the type of empowerment that would allow us to rewrite the rules.
And so how big do inflections need to be? I mean, is it as big as like the internet, mobile, AI, or can be something smaller, like a societal change? Like how wide is that point?
Yeah, so they can vary in size and number, right? And so it probably helps to kind of start by just defining what I mean by that. So like to me, an inflection is a turning point. And so like, for example, Moore's law is not an inflection, it's an improvement curve. Mm-hmm. So an inflection, one of the things that's so important about startups is to get the timing right. You see all kinds of good ideas that don't work just because they were too early or too late. Usually it's because they're too early. And so an inflection is something new, a specific new thing that's introduced by somebody else, not a startup, that creates the conditions for the first time for radical empowering change. And so like, a minute ago I was talking about Lyft. Lyft, the inflection was that the iPhone 4S had a GPS locator chip in it. And so because of that, a new form of empowerment was unleashed. Now, all of a sudden, I could use an algorithm and I could build an app and I could locate someone within 1 meter accuracy without asking them for their location. I could just send an API call. And then you start to say, okay, who does that inflection empower? Potentially a lot of people, because almost everybody owns smartphones and almost everybody upgrades their smartphones. And so that's, that would be an example of an inflection. With Instagram, the inflection was more about the iPhone camera having enough megapixels. I think it was kind of the one that was released in 2009, 2010, where it had enough megapixels where you could say, you know what, I can kind of use this as my camera when I go on vacations. It's, I can take good enough pictures that I would want to share it as if it was a photograph. And so that empowered Instagram. Now, phone cameras were always improving, right? They started out really bad and got progressively less bad, but eventually they got to a tipping point where they were good enough to create a new set of empowering conditions for people who wanted to use cameras. And so that's the first thing we always look for is the inflection. And when I see an idea, You asked this a second ago, right? When I see an idea, how do I evaluate it? Yes, I want to see what the product is, but I want to stress test the inflection. I want to understand, does this idea embody inflections, and how powerful is the inflection? How much empowerment does it provide for people? Because the more empowerment it provides, the more the entrepreneur can bend the arc of the present to a radically different future. And that's what I want, right? I want, like most people, when they think of the future, they forecast. They think that the future will be a forward projection of the present, but it'll mostly resemble the present. The great entrepreneurs backcast. They say, I only win if the future is radically different. I only win if I can work backwards from a radically different future defined by radically different rules. And it's the inflection that catapults or transports the entrepreneur to that radically different future, right? We need some set of empowering capabilities for that different future to be realized.
Does the value of the startup, you talk about the empowerment of the inflection. So, and in both the case of like the Instagram and Lyft, we talk about like the GPS or the power of the camera. Like, I think of it when I saw it in the book, right? It's inflections to insights to ideas to movements. Is it additive? Is it multiplicative? Like the point is, like, can the inflection be small, the insight be large, and that creates a different effect? So, like, how much does those like versus we have a whole like just does the size of the inflection be empowering and the insight be so great that creates something? Because I think of Instagram and what it's been able to do, and
Yeah.
I would think that the inflection wasn't that large, but it was large enough to create that
Yeah.
that point.
And it was pretty large when you think about it, right? Because there was an inflection both in the capabilities of the camera, but there was also an inflection of the number of people who had such cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And so, right. So, but I love your question. So here's how I would net out the theory writ large, because what is a theory really? It's an explanation, right? It's an explanation for a mechanism for how something happens. And inflection theory basically says there is a mechanism for creating breakthroughs. It starts out with the insight. The insight answers a specific question, which is, what do we know about the future that's powerful and not obvious? The power comes from the inflections and the empowerment that they provide. The more empowerment, the better, because the more empowerment an inflection provides, the more radically superior a solution we can offer can be. And so we do want the biggest inflections possible. But we also want to know something about that inflection. Like the Lyft guys, the GPS locator was the inflection. The non-obvious insight was, oh, that means you could do sharing economy for cars. And that was a non-consensus insight in the sense that it seemed crazy that a stranger would want to get in another stranger's car, right? Like that seems kind of crazy to most people. But that's the first breakthrough, is the insight breakthrough. The more powerful the inflections are, the more powerful the insight can be. The more non-consensus the insight is, the more powerful it has the potential to be. And then you answer the question, what do we know about the future that's not obvious? The next part of the breakthrough, it goes in a sequence, is product market fit. And this is the one everybody talks about. Product market fit, in my mind, answers another simple question, which is, what can we uniquely offer that people are desperate for? And if you think about it, if you have a valid insight, you've already solved the uniqueness part. And so your implementation of the product, the goal is to navigate the insight to the desperate. And the reason that we've made so much money on pivots, and the reason that pivots happen quite often, is if the insight is valid, you have a first mover advantage into the future. And so you're still right about the future. You're just not necessarily right yet about the right implementation of your insight or the right person to offer that implementation to. But product market fit is when you form that connection. And then after that, just for completeness sake, you have the growth breakthrough. You start to say, okay, how can I scale according to a predictable pattern exponentially? And if you have created something unique that people are desperate for at scale, now all of a sudden growth, you can scale at will, because you don't have to throw money at the problem of growing. All you have to do is syndicate the truth. Because the obviousness of your superiority is true, right? And so like, and what your question suggests, I really like. every component has an impact on the next component, right? So if you have a very powerful insight, it's almost like a Newton's cradle, right? That energy gets
Mhm.
transferred to your efforts to create product market fit. And if you do that really well, then energetically that energy gets transferred to your growth breakthrough. And so that's the mechanism for how startups and startup capitalists change the future. They don't build moats, they create this breakthrough sequence. And by harnessing the energy of the inflections and the insights and their navigation of an implementation to the desperate, they radically alter people's perception of what's possible. They break the pattern of how people do things. And so that's the reason that I called the book Pattern Breakers, is that pattern breakers have pattern breaking ideas that defy the assumptions of how products should be and what we expect of them. But they also, we'll get to this later, I think, they also engage in pattern breaking actions because, a startup by definition, the kinds I'm describing, is a disagreeable act. And, the status quo has the word status in it. And so the president is going to fight back, and it's not going to fight back fair. The president isn't interested in negotiating with you and your future. The president wants to stop you from disrupting what it already likes and what it already knows.
Well, and it's funny you talk about. We always hear back to what you said in the beginning, and doing all the right things. We're building these moats, and I hear that term all the time. And you're supposed to be talking about that. I'm an angel investor too, and that's one of the questions we've always been taught to ask. And then I think about the things like what Elon's done with patents and open sourcing them all, because he, as you said, he creates the insights and then creates the energy and the momentum ahead. It's like, I don't need the moat. Like, I'm going to be so far ahead of everybody that fine.
Well, or it's more like, when you're a startup capitalist, you're not trying to create a moat. It's a moat. It's more like you're a catapult with a fiery rock and gas
Mm-hmm.
firing over the walls of the moat, right? And so you're not like that. That's what I really came to realize, is that it reminds me of evolution. If you look at fossils, they'll look similar for multiple generations, and the evolutionary traits doesn't vary that much. But then all of a sudden, go from dinosaurs to mammals. How does that happen? Well, a meteor hits the earth, or a flood wipes out something. It's called punctuated equilibrium. And value does come from compounding. Companies create value by compounding their advantages and bringing more abundance and better products to people. But every now and then you want that punctuated equilibrium. And it's the corporate capitalist job to keep the fossil record always evolving. It's the startup capitalist job to say, no, I'm going to come in with something radically different. I'm going to start a flood and change the subject and change the rules and the laws of physics and space-time altogether.
Yeah.
And so here's what's the problem with most entrepreneurship frameworks. They study startups that fail. Like, they'll say, this startup failed because there wasn't a market, so you should start by looking for big markets. Or this startup failed because it didn't have a business model, you should do a business model canvas. And those things are good to do, but those are like how you avoid unforced errors. So clearly you can fail if you have unforced errors that become existential. But startups don't create breakthroughs by avoiding mistakes. Startups create breakthroughs by breaking free from the boundaries and the conditions and the limitations of the present. And so what we want to understand is, what are those forces that provide that empowerment? How can we harness those forces? Because that's the thing that that's the thing time and again that I noticed was the better explanation for why these startups had the breakthroughs.
So I'm thinking of some of these kind of breakthroughs and inflections as layers. I mean, a question I had written ahead of time, and as we're talking, I've been thinking about it slightly different, because I asked kind of, does it always happen in this order of inflections, insights, ideas, and movements? Can you have inflections and movements and drawing into other startups? But now that I think about it, if you're having inflections to movements that in and of itself is probably an inflection at a higher level that's then causing somebody else. So the inflections that Apple and the iPhone are causing, and the movements those are causing, is what opened up the opportunities for Instagram and Lyft as the examples there.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's good to have good definitions about these things, right? So people might say, well, the iPhone had inflections in it, but wasn't it itself an inflection? And I'm like, yeah, that's true, but you can kind of get your mind sort of wrapped up in these kind of recursive questions. And so I was like, okay, what are we really getting at here, and what's the point? The point is that every now and then something new gets introduced, and that new thing creates new forms of empowerment. And so what the startup capitalist does is they translate that new form of empowerment into an insight for how to deliver that power. And so, the empowerment's iPhone 4S has a GPS locator chip. The insight is, oh, you could do a transportation network of independent drivers and riders. And the movement is a different thing. So, like, what happens with the when you think different and when you embody inflection theory in your idea, you're an entrepreneur out in the future. And you're sitting out there in the future, and you're right about what the future could be. You're right about what your implementation and insight could be. But being out in the future by yourself doesn't do any good, right? Like you have to get other people to move with you to that different future that you envision. And that's where movements come in. So what you want to do is you want to create a movement that moves the right people with you so that you and your fellow movers who join the movement can co-create the future, right? So the future isn't created just by the founder, just by the idea. It's created by the initial set. It's co-created by the initial set of believers in that idea, by the people who are desperate to avail themselves of the empowerment of the insight. And so, and that's really different. Like most people, when they think of their quote unquote go to market motion as a startup, they think about it in a classical, what's my marketing mix? Who are my targets? But what I would assert to you is that most of the great startups I've seen are movements. Like Tesla's a great example. You mentioned earlier, Elon Musk. You go into Tesla's headquarters, it doesn't say as their mission, make the best cars. The word cars isn't even in their mission. It says accelerate the world's transformation to sustainable energy. And so like a great movement appeals to a higher purpose, and it activates the grievances of a minority against the tyranny of a majority. And, most of the times we think about movements, we think about, say, civil rights, Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
But like Martin Luther King forced a choice and not a comparison. He's like, you either believe that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by their color of their skin or not. There's no middle ground. You can't be kind of racist, right? You occupy this future or don't. But like, there's no way to reconcile the world you're in versus the world that could be. You have to decide, right? And so movements are very powerful. The other thing that movements do is they take the greatest perceived strength of the status quo and reposition it around the weakness in the strength. So like Airbnb, Brian Chesky didn't say hotels are no good. Brian Chesky instead says, look, you have a choice. If you want to stay in the Four Seasons in Paris, you can. It'll be central downtown. It'll look like the Four Seasons in New York City or in Austin, Texas, or in San Francisco, and you'll have a wonderful, guaranteed Four Seasons experience. Oh, you might want to live instead like a local in the neighboring neighborhoods of Paris, and you might want to live like a Parisian in a house built in the 1700s or something that embodies the beauty of the left bank of Parisian architecture. And, I don't have to say that Four Seasons is bad for you to think that this other thing is good. It's just that you can't reconcile the two. So now you're Four Seasons. How do you respond to that competitive strategy? It's very hard, right? Like your entire business has been predicated on the compounding advantages of being really good at the pattern of how you built hotels. And now Brian Chesky's off breaking the pattern, and he's telling the world that the thing that made you strong, he's doing a judo throw, right? He's using your size against you to make your greatest strength into your greatest weakness. And so that's the other things that movements do is they make what seemed to be appealing about the status quo something it needs to apologize for. And by doing that, now the founder, right, doesn't fight fair, right, which is what we want to do. We want to engage in an unfair fight that is biased against the incumbency rather than overcomes the power of the incumbency.
Well, and that not fighting fair, even in the language, I loved the language you used in the book. This was, I think, earlier in team building, but you talked about not building the team, but bringing on co-conspirators.
Yes.
And it's that kind of that shared secret. I think that goes from the team all the way to the movement of like we're changing something. We've got a conspiracy, but in the best possible use of the word, right? We're creating a revolution in this industry.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of an optimistic conspiracy, right?
Yes.
And it's sort of like and it's interesting, and it relates to a really important point. It's actually a good thing if most people don't like your idea at first,
Hmm.
and when you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because human beings are conditioned to like things, and so if everybody likes your startup idea, it's too similar to what they already know, which means it's not non-consensus enough, which means it doesn't break free enough from norms. And so the best startup ideas tend to have a small number of people who are hyperly vigilant, who are like, "Oh my God, this is amazing. Where have you been all my life?" You're describing it to an early user, and they steal the whiteboard pen out of your hand and complete the diagram for you. They've tried to solve this problem before and failed, but they've almost been waiting for someone like you to show up, and they do see themselves as co-conspirators, and that's why I like to say that you and your co-conspirators co-create the future. And most people are going to see your idea, even some of the most well-meaning people, and they're still bound by convention, and they're gonna either be lukewarm to it, to negative, to just not caring. And what some founders don't always realize is, don't waste your time trying to convince those people at first. And so, what happens too often is, a founder will be pitching a lot of VCs, and the VCs won't like the idea. And then because they don't like the idea, they're like, okay, I need another slide that addresses that objection. And what ends up happening is what I call a Franken deck, where it's
Hmm.
like there's like 30 slides to imagine any possible objection. And now it's like I was the VC who was prepared to believe your crazy insight, but we never got to it because I got confused. I got lost in a maze of slides talking about a whole bunch of different things I don't care about. And so, like what I like to say to founders is, and I've learned this the hard way, the best startups are movements initiated by founders with a fundamental insight about the future, and then they enlist co-conspirators to join that movement, and that includes early employees, customers, investors. But the best startups are a set of co-conspirators believing in the right kind of crazy together. And so, early startup movements are animated by belief more than utility. It's like people buy from your startup not because just your value proposition, they buy because they believe what you believe.
So so then how do you balance that with I feel like the speed of hype cycle and even adoption, right? There was like Instagram got to 100 million users in X number of days and then ChatGPT was what, 5 days? And
Yeah.
so how are those two then things starting to balance out?
Yeah. Some movements happen faster than others, right? So, like Airbnb actually didn't happen that fast. It had to accumulate and gather over time. There had to be proof points. Um, Lyft, Lyft and Okta are the two that I was involved with that just got instant ignition when it's like they get product market fit, and it's just obvious to everybody very quickly that this is the answer. And
Mhm.
so in that case, Reid Hoffman has a term called blitz scaling, and I think some people misuse that term. I don't think Reid was trying to say always blitz scale, but there are times where markets go through more of an adoption life cycle, where you have the early innovative customers, and then you have the visionaries, and then the pragmatists, and then the laggards and stuff
Very
like that,
crossing the chasm.
crossing the chasm.
Yeah.
And that's probably the more typical way that it plays out. And what you're trying to do when you start a movement is, it's an instantiation of that thought process. You're saying, okay, I want to find my early movers, and I want to spend my ergs of energy and limited time and resources finding those people, getting them to move with me. And the important thing is to realize they're joining a movement, not just buying your product, and they're co-creating the future with you. But every now and then you get something like ride sharing. And with ride sharing, I remember they launched Lyft, and we had this associate named Tommy Leap, and it was a week after they'd launched. Tommy comes into our team meeting, we call it the huddle, and he says, "We are going to make a fortune on this Lyft deal." And we're like, "Yeah, we're excited about it too. We hope it works. It's kind of illegal. We'll see what happens." because you don't understand. He's like, every single one of my friends is using this thing, and it's just like, he's like, it is spreading in San Francisco like wildfire. This thing is going to be a phenomenon. And I remember just curiously going into San Francisco to try it, got in the car, fist bumped the driver, got a ride somewhere, and you see these cars with pink mustaches riding all over the place. And I could tell he was right. Like, it was one of those things where you just immediately knew it was a hit product. And then Travis Kalanick sees it from, Uber Cab, and he decides to do Uber X, and he raises like $500 million from Google Ventures. And so now you're in this weird situation where the market will be satisfied. It's just the question of who's going to satisfy the market. The option of being capital efficient is no longer available to you, because if you decide to grow in a capital efficient way, Travis Kalanick's going to raise tens of billions of dollars and just go invade every city and capture all the demand. And so that does sometimes happen. You sometimes have this, it's a different kind of inflection, but you have this inflection where the entire world is energized to want this thing. And the question is just who's going to satisfy the world's demand the quickest. And that can happen. That's happening right now in LLMs, for example.
Right, that's what I was going to ask. So when you have a situation like what we're having with LLMs and maybe AI in general, are we, because there's so much, one, the inflection is still so relatively new, right? I think there's probably still technological development that can happen, but I quote a quote from the book. You say a powerful insight contradicts conventional wisdom, but because so many people are running in, how quickly is everything becoming conventional wisdom? So are insights suddenly becoming, minor insights quickly?
That's right. And you put your finger on something that has been my greatest challenge with AI. So I haven't made a whole lot of AI investments lately. So one just came out this week, actually, created by humans with Trip Adler. But so why haven't I made that many AI investments? The inflections behind AI are incredibly powerful, right? They're just awesome. They're more than an inflection. It's like a sea change, right? It feels like a sea change in the way that mass computation did with the personal computer, or mass connectivity did with the internet and the smartphone. I like to say now we're in the mass cognition sea change, and like certain cognitive tasks are becoming asymptotically free, the way communications bandwidth once did, the way microprocessing power once did. So the inflections are there. You see new ones every week. The problem I'm seeing in AI is I'm not seeing very many insights. I'm seeing great ideas where I'm like, yes, I can see exactly why someone will want this. And I can also see why there's probably 10 of them just like it right now. And there'll be another 100 soon. And when the next LLM comes out of OpenAI, this may be obsoleted by what comes out. And so the challenging thing I'm finding in AI is finding legitimate insights. And so I've been very careful about how often I write checks and when I do so.
So I think that's a perfect example. I'm sure that a lot of AI companies that you said are coming to your door. So then how are you, like, in practice, using inflection theory to then weed out you're right, it sounds plausible, there's probably going to be 100 of them, people are going to want this, versus the truly compounding, powerful, insight-driven idea?
Yeah, so maybe it's good to illustrate with a couple of examples that we said yes to, right, in AI. So one is a company I invested in a few years ago called Applied Intuition. And Applied Intuition creates software that allows car companies and AV companies, and now increasingly like defense, anybody with moving big things, to do autonomous vehicle simulation and also electric vehicle software platforms. So, if you're going to do a self-driving car, you want to test it for a whole lot of miles. And what they created was the ability to simulate billions, if not trillions of miles in a simulator. And so that helps them anticipate all the corner cases and things like that. But then what also happened is Tesla started to become the most valuable car company. And every car company started to realize, we don't know how to do a software-defined car the way Tesla does. Our entire business, the pattern of our business has been predicated by a supply chain that uses Bosch and a bunch of machine shops that, OEM suppliers and folks. And now, Tesla looks more like a computer with wheels. And, they're using GPU chips, they're using custom chips and custom operating system software, that type of thing. Well, Castor Eunice, who's the founder and his co-founder, grew up in Detroit. Castor went to General Motors Institute before going to Harvard Business School. He'd started a startup before that had succeeded. And then he was at Google and he was working on the Maps team, and Peter Ludwig was working on the Waymo team. And so, if you're going to ask car companies for hundreds of millions of dollars, you're looking across the table at the CEO of that car company. That guy's got to believe you can do the job. And those two founders were from Central Casting, right? Like Sam Altman doesn't know how to make a self-driving car, right? He knows a lot about AI, but like he's not going to be able to go to the CEO of one of the largest car companies in the world and say, hey, here's some software, good luck. And so like there's a certain set of capabilities that you need, a certain set of credibility. I call it founder future fit, right? It's like you want to ask, why is this the team of all teams in the world who would pull this off? What is it about them? And so, Castor's like, I understand. I've been at real car companies. I've been building AV tech inside of Waymo and Google. I have all of the best talent in the world. I've got a bunch of people who are on the Tesla full self-driving team. I got a bunch of people who are on the Waymo team. I got a bunch of people who are at Zoox, right? Like I have access to talent that you just can't get to. And so I'm your only path. If you think that moving to EVs and AVs is an existential problem for your car company, and you're desperate to solve that problem, I uniquely offer this. And so that would be one example. But like, for a company like that, an enterprise, you need to ask for giant contracts over $100 million. You need to have access to talent that's so proprietary, it's almost like it's a cornered resource. You need to be able to show that you understand the core business of that customer in a very detailed way, that you understand the customer's business almost as well as they do. And then you need to be able to demonstrate that you have the engineering chops to actually deliver in production the things that they need to solve their existential worry. And so there aren't very many of those, right? But like that would be an example of an AI company I'd be interested in.
So how are you thinking then about, I guess that this one's a perfect example of, so you get the founder future fit and then, but like direct industry experience versus outsider experience versus, and especially when we're creating new industries.
Yep.
Does it matter? Does it depend on it? Or is it the boxes you check?
So I love this question, right? So, I probably should have mentioned that a lot of this relates to the idea itself. So I have this term, I call it founder future fit. And like Castor Eunice had great founder future fit to build a company like Applied Intuition. But he didn't have great founder future fit to create Justin TV, right? Like Justin Kahn was 18 months out of college and he's live streaming his life 24/7. But Justin didn't have any kids. He wasn't married. He didn't have any experience. Mark Andreessen, when he created the Mosaic browser, everybody thought the digital superhighway was going to be created by the government or Time Warner or by, Microsoft Network. And Mark was just tinkering with the technologies of the World Wide Web. The government had only recently even opened up the internet for business. And so Mark had the advantage of a beginner's mind. Mark didn't have to unlearn the way the digital superhighway was going to be built because he didn't know anything about business. And so there are times where not knowing anything about business is an advantage because you're living in a future that's so radically different that, your proprietary knowledge and first mover advantage into the future and your domain expertise about that future overcomes your lack of expertise about traditional business. In fact, the expertise about traditional business becomes a pattern that you can't shake because you don't even realize it's a pattern. And so, it's kind of like I
see that problem in biohealth a lot.
Yeah. So like if everybody in the world has been living in Cartesian coordinates and now you're Mark Andreessen, you never learned about Cartesian coordinates. The first time you ever learned, you were living in polar coordinates. And you're like, well, of course the world's going to live in polar coordinates. That's the world I'm living in. And you don't even have to translate between the two because you only know that future, right? So you just plunge headlong into that future, and all of your assumptions are perfectly matched to that future. And so, Eric Yuan, when he started Zoom, he'd been at Cisco. He'd started, I can't remember what the prior video conferencing company he was at that got acquired by Cisco, but like he'd been tinkering with this stuff his whole life. He'd been thinking about video conferencing software his whole life, at least his whole career. And so, he was just like perfectly embodied the traits of somebody who's likely going to be living in a valid future when it came to that domain.
So I want to use that as a pivot on the actual influences that play into the way people, because I think one of the big things coming from the book was about living in the future and how
Yes.
important that is. And especially we talk about future founder fit. So what do you think about the role of the ecosystems themselves and how they play in getting people out of the present and into the future? And are you going to get different insights if you're in Silicon Valley versus New York versus Austin?
Potentially you could, but I would say I tend to be more fine grained about that. So the basic idea is that, and this is one of the most counterintuitive lessons I learned, is that if you want to come up with a great startup idea, don't try to think of a startup. And so it's a little bit Zen, right? And why is that? Well, like most people, they think of startup ideation and they think of vision as like having a better pair of binoculars and seeing farther over the mountains. And what I learned in my analysis of all these breakthrough founders is that's not the right way to think about vision. So like the right way is what William Gibson used to say, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So the next great startup is coming from a future that somebody is probably living in right now, this minute. So, before the Mosaic browser became a phenomenon and started the internet revolution, Mark Andreessen was tinkering with the nascent standards of the World Wide Web from CERN, right? And he was doing it in a supercomputer lab at the University of Illinois. Bob Metcalfe, who's kind of an Austin institution now, right? Like, yep. Bob Metcalfe wasn't trying to think of a startup when he co-invented the Ethernet. He was in Xerox PARC trying to share a laser printer among a bunch of Xerox Alto workstations that were $100,000 per desktop. But if you were Bob Metcalfe, you're like, okay, I'm living in a time machine. If you're Bob Metcalfe, you're like, of course networks are going to be this way. Of course networks are going to want to share a laser printer. And so what occasionally happens is an entrepreneur is living in a time machine before the rest of us, and they see the future. And this is the important thing. They didn't try to think of a startup. They built what was missing in the future, right? So it's like Bob Metcalfe's like, I can't share this laser printer. I need to build the thing that lets me share it. Mark Andreessen's like, I can't collaborate with other researchers using these internet technologies. I need to create a browser that allows me to put up pages and so that we can collaborate. But in both cases, they were making the future immediately more useful for them. And when you build what's missing in the future, your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right because you're solving a real problem that you know exists. The number one reason startup ideas fail is they solve a problem that we imagine is true, but that isn't true. They solve a non-existent problem. We have our own image about what the future will be, but our image about the future is wrong because it's just a made up image in our mind. It's not validated by real people's desperation to have that empowerment. If you're building something that's missing in the future, you're encountering barriers. You're desperate to overcome those barriers. And so you build the missing thing.
So are we looking for, are they just innate outliers who are saying, I'm willing to build what doesn't exist or imagining this other future? Or can you have, or do you have to have a generalized culture of where you are in, whether that be at the company or anything, of the ability to be countercultural, be able to say like, okay, this, you said the status quo itself, status, rewards staying the same. So you have to be able to say, I'm willing to be different and a little weird to say this is, or disagreeable in kind of the way that you put it. This is wrong. And I see it's wrong and I'm going to do something different.
Yeah. And Jason, I would go even a slight step further. So like what happens? So like I'm going to give a mock example of a pitch, and I bet it'll sound familiar to you. So, like, somebody came to me the other day and said, mental health is a crisis. And I'm like, I agree. I'm building a mental health app that embodies, philosophies of cognitive behavior theory. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting. And then I say, why is this idea from the future? And they're like, well, in the future, mental health needs to be solved. And I'm like, okay, I agree, but I'm not interested in your ideas about the future. I want to know, in what way are you living in it right now? Like, living in the future is not having an opinion about the future. It's not having a vision about the future. Living in the future means you're living in it. You're getting your hands dirty with it. And in getting your hands dirty with it, you directly experience what's new about it. And that's how pattern breakers happen. Pattern breakers are tinkering with new technology in the future. And it's by that firsthand interaction that they themselves viscerally see the opportunities to think, feel, and act differently than how other people are thinking. It's by having that direct discussion, that direct feedback loop, that direct getting your hands dirty with it, that you see firsthand what the new pattern will be. But it's like, if I'm just thinking about solving mental health as if it's a truism, it's very unlikely I'm going to have a fundamental insight. Lots of other people know that mental health's a problem. Lots of other people know it should be solved. I'm interested in knowing why you got to a different future before other people did, and what you discovered in that future that was missing. And so I sometimes, I didn't talk about this in the book, I use the metaphor of an oasis. We're all living on a sand dune. Somebody wanders off and finds an oasis. Once you're in the oasis, the difference between the oasis and the sand is obvious. You see it everywhere you look. There's coconut trees, there's water, you're sipping water. You're like, this is awesome. Now, what's a startup really like? You're in the oasis. You know what's different about the oasis. Come back to the sand dune and you say to the people, hey, there's an oasis over there. Most people say, I think you're full of crap. I think that's a mirage. You're crazy. The last guy who said that there was an oasis, we never saw him again. He never came back. We think he didn't survive. And so what a startup movement is, it's the first set of people who say, hey, you know what? I kind of think I agree with you. And so then they go follow that guy to the oasis. And now everybody's like, hot damn, this oasis is awesome. And then a few more people come back and they say, no, dude, it's for real. There's like an oasis. And pretty soon everybody's like, why would I want to be a dork and stay on this sand dune with these laggards? These people are idiots. I want to go hang out and party in the oasis. And so, but you'll notice that he didn't discover what was different about the oasis by looking over the horizon and like trying to chart some course to something that looked different. And I have an opinion. Oh, there's an oasis over there. It's only by being in it directly can you understand what's new about it, what's different about it. And so that's why it's so important. So I like to say, before you even get out of the building, you want to get out of the present. You want to get it. You want to catapult yourself to a different future where the assumptions and the technologies are cutting edge, and where the very assumptions of what it takes to succeed are different.
So I don't know if this is correlation or causation, but where does then the role of like fiction play into the way that people think? And one of the reasons this is coming up, so I'm working my way with my 10-year-old through the Lord of the Rings extended edition, which is like 12 plus hours. We're getting our way through. And it was really funny because, of course, I knew this logically because I'd heard all of this, but it's funny to be like, oh, and then there's the Palantir, there's Anduril, like all of these obviously company names that we know now, but we know where their origins coming from. And so you see these very successful entrepreneurs who are clearly influenced either by this science fiction or that. And so is it that people who are open to this and it's more of a signal, or is it no, being open it's an influence and getting them out to at least be thinking of different futures or fantasy and the like?
Yeah, I love this question too. So first time anybody's asked it to be about this topic on this book. So there's a book by a guy named Brian Arthur, who is more famous for coining the term increasing returns economics, and he's part of the Santa Fe Institute, studies chaos and complexity theory. And he wrote a book called The Nature of Technology, What It Is and How It Evolves. And what he basically argues in the book is that all new technology is a combination of something new that's empowering with something already understood. It's kind of, you're kind of connecting different dots. And so very creative people tend to be really good at connecting dots in different ways, in different patterns. And so one way to think about a pattern is it's an existing connection of existing dots. And everybody just assumes that's how it is. What the entrepreneur does is they tinker with something new, and their life experience is broad enough somehow that they're able to connect dots from the past to dots from the future. So like, we talked about Mark Andreessen with Mosaic a minute ago. A lot of people don't know how well read Mark Andreessen is, right? But he is extraordinarily well read and always has been. So like, for example, when he was doing the Mosaic browser, he was reading essays by Vannevar Bush from the 1940s about this thing called a Memex, that would be this thing that had hyperlinks and stuff like that. He'd studied HyperCard from Apple. He was a history buff. And so Andreessen is the type of person who believes all of it will happen. It's just a question of when is it time? Is it ready to happen? And so when he was tinkering with the technologies, the internet and that supercomputer lab, he's like, is now the time that something like a Memex could be built? But his technical excellence was informed by a breadth of understanding and curiosity. And, when you study people who create breakthroughs, and unfortunately, I felt like taking this task on would have been too much for this book. But like I spent,
there's always another book.
Yeah, who God only knows, right? But I studied about 20 people, 20 books, that is, of how do breakthroughs happen, and is there a process, and is there things that we can learn, and almost all of them kind of converge around this idea of combinatory play, that you have a lot of dots that you connect in different ways, that you're not too attached to being right about the new pattern being right. It's just you're willing to assume that the current pattern isn't the only way. And so the people who tend to have the best breakthrough ideas collect more and better dots and connect them in more combinatorial ways until and then their minds, you said this a minute ago, they're open enough to new experiences that they enjoy the combinatory play of looking at these different combinations. And it's the combinatory play of the new cutting edge technology with what's come before that. In this book by Brian Arthur shows example after example of how that happened, and why that is.
So I want to pivot to inflection theory and pattern breaking, but on the VC side. We talked a lot of this from founders and startups. So first off, can you pattern, okay, let me use this word too many times. Can you pattern match for pattern breakers without it turning into like a herd mentality?
Right. It's a good question. And, you're asking a nice version of it, right? Like the people who don't like me as much say, hey, aren't you being sort of a hypocrite here, because you say that pattern matching is bad, but isn't pattern breaking and the characteristics of them, isn't that another pattern, right? So there's kind of this recursive problem with that, right? So the way I look at it is, I'm not trying to say pattern breaking good, pattern matching bad. The mind is a system that tries to make sense of the world. And like when I brushed my teeth this morning, I brush my teeth pretty much the same way I always do. I don't sit there and debate first principles of toothpaste, or should I use a brush, or why have teeth, or whatever. Like, I'm kind of like, okay, you know what? It kind of works good enough. Or how I get to work. I'm like, I don't existentially debate, is this the best way to go to work? Should I get in my car, go to work this way? I just kind of do it. So pattern matching is good because it helped us know that when we hear a saber-toothed tiger roar, run the other way. So for the most part, pattern matching allows our minds to create order and chaos. It's a chaotic world with lots of inputs and lots of data, lots of noise. We need a way to make decisions that preserves us. But what we don't realize is that by matching patterns, we sometimes don't see the obvious. And so, there's this story about two fish. They're two little bitty fish, and they're swimming in the ocean. And this big fish swims up and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the little fish say, they swim a little bit longer. And then one says to the other, "What the hell is water?" And it's like, most of us assume the world around us just kind of is what it is. And we don't know that the thing that's in our pocket would allow us to create a ride sharing network. We don't, like the wheel for over 500 years, it was used horizontally to make pottery. And, the guy that did that was pretty inventive because making pots was pretty hard before the wheel. But it took somebody else to discover that you could mount it vertically and use it for transportation. And so, but like most people, if you'd said, what's a wheel for over 500 years, they would have said, oh man, it's a breakthrough for making pottery. It would have never occurred to them that it could have been used for that there was other patterns, right, for how to use that wheel. And so that's what I'm really getting at, is that it's like pattern matching is more like the fossil record compounding and evolving in an evolutionary incremental way, sustaining innovation, if you will. But you also need from time to time the pattern breaking. And it's the pattern breaking that lets the entrepreneur fight fair. It's the pattern matching that lets the established business not fight fair. So you just got to decide how you want to fight. And I'm like, what I like to say to founders is I don't want to back somebody that wants to fight fair, right? I'm looking for the person that wants to fight unfair and, isn't interested in accommodating the status quo.
So is the investor's role for you only to be hunting and empowering pattern breakers, or is there a way for VCs to be using inflection theories to be kind of catalyzing more at a macro scale, seeing beyond, each individual company?
Well, inflection theory helps me in the sense that it makes me more awake. So like, for example, we all know that LLMs are exciting, but you could say, okay, in what way is it an inflection? Well, if I was going to answer that question, I'd say, well, LLMs provide specific types of empowerment. They generate content, they summarize things, they shorten things. There's like a bunch of things that they can do. And then I would say, okay, now let's imagine that I'm a consumer and I want to have more fun. In what ways could an LLM generate things that are fun? In what ways could an LLM generate things that are a substitute for a conversation? In what way could LLMs generate things that summarize things or that streamline things? And so, and I don't know the answer, right? But like with my partners or with other people, I might have some dinner and we just brainstorm that kind of stuff. And we say, like, for example, could somebody create a network where most of the entities on the network are non-human and you're interacting with non-humans? Well, does that accelerate the ability to create a network effect or to overcome the cold start problem? Things like that. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is, but by engaging in that form of combinatory play, empowering capabilities, types of empowerment, I could do the same. How might LLMs provide empowerment that impacts self-driving cars? How might it impact legal departments and companies? How might it impact CFO of a company? What are the empowering things? What are the types of empowerment that people desire? Connect the dots in different ways. And now an entrepreneur comes in and says, hey, I've been playing with this idea for instant messaging meets LLMs, and it would empower users to have fun in this entirely new way. And Snap isn't going to do it because it's going to violate their security protocols. I'm like, okay, that's my guy. And so like, I don't have to know what the answer will be. It's just like, I just need to be awake to the contrarian insight when I see it. I need to be ready to have a mind that's prepared to absorb the insight when I see it.
So how do you think about it kind of gets back to the timing questions, but if there are, if statements involved where like I don't want to say it's so much of a big inflections, but A with B, like company A with company B will do better. And, does that go into how you're thinking about making the selection? Is that how thinking about building out your portfolio? Is it always, I have to think about every company individually so you're not systematizing risk?
It's a little bit more the latter. So like I look at it like, Charles Darwin was in the Galapagos Islands and he was spotting all these mutations. these different beaked finches, and he wrote The Origin of Species based on what he saw there. I think that seed investing in particular is a lot like bird spotting. And so you're not looking for something that looks like anything you've seen. You're looking for a capitalist mutation. And you're kind of saying that there are things that allow a capitalist entity to mutate. And it's these inflections, and it's these insights, and it's these founders living in the future. And so here's the weird part of it. And I hope that this doesn't seem too arcane. Most people, when they take a risk, they would like to see the path to how they succeed. They think of it more like you're playing poker or roulette or blackjack. It's like, okay, what are my odds? But like, I understand that if it goes on red, I win. If it goes on black, I lose. That's not how I think about investing. I think about investing as there is a very powerful, wildly asymmetric, but uncertain and only slightly visible future. And I believe that this person is ideally fit to pursue that future. And I don't have to know how the dots will forward connect. It's kind of like when the Kansas City Chiefs have the ball in the Super Bowl, I don't have to know the exact plays that Patrick Mahomes is going to run. I'm like, because I was a 49er fan, I'm like, oh shit, Patrick Mahomes has the ball, right? And I know that he embodies a set of traits where I'm going to get surprised on the upside by how he jukes and jives and how he leads, right? And so great startup ideas are a radical upside, highly risky, ambiguous, and therefore underpriced future. So like, I'm not interested in just the probability of succeeding. I'm interested in the expected value of the opportunity. And if the expected value is massively high, if it works, I can accept and tolerate massive risk and massive uncertainty. Most people pursue ideas where it's more tangible how they're going to get to the future. And the problem with that is that by doing that, they're pursuing an idea that's more obvious, which makes it more likely to be consensus. You're better off not being attached to being absolutely right about the first product that you do, but instead pursuing a massively higher expected upside value future. And you just count on the fact that the founder is kind of like Patrick Mahomes, right? Like the founder will audible at the line of scrimmage and figure things out and notice what they're hearing from the customers and identify what's missing and pivot to the right place. I don't have to know all the ways that will happen. And what I would argue is that if I try to know those things, I'm seeking false precision. And so like, I never want as a seed investor to try to be precise about things that can't be quantified or can't be understood yet, right? I want to understand what really needs to be understood, which I believe is founder future fit and the power of the insight and the underlying inflections. And then the founder's ability to move like-minded co-conspirators to a different future over time.
Well, that leads, I think, to a great kind of getting towards the end here, and we're kind of hitting a hard stop. You compared startups to jazz. You talked about, Patrick Mahomes has the ball. You don't know what he's going to do. In pattern breakers, it's kind of, you don't know, the certainty, the precision of the future. So, and I remember at the beginning of your book, you talked about that one of the origins of this was a guest appearance at the Stanford Business School entrepreneurship course. So when I see these curriculums, whether they're at schools or accelerators, like, are we trying to compartmentalize and systematize something that can't be even really taught in this way?
Yes. I think most entrepreneurship is taught wrong, in my view, when it comes to this. And here's why. School normally teaches subjects where there is a right answer. Right, like if I do my times tables, or I do an algebra equation, or like I take a calculus test, or even if I write a paper, there's a right answer. And the problem with that is that breakthroughs, by definition, are undiscovered, and so you can't have a recipe for breakthrough. That was kind of one of the other things I learned. And when you think about it, it's obvious, right? Like, so if you and I have a recipe for making a cake, we're going to make a cake that's roughly similar, but somebody's already figured out how to make that cake, right? Like if you're going to have a new type of dish, you have to experiment with ingredients in a way that nobody's ever experimented with them before. And so what we want is not a recipe. And too many people seek a methodology, and too many people try to teach a methodology. And so, like, if you're a teacher, it's tempting to say, I'm going to normalize what I've seen entrepreneurs do, and I'm going to come up with a method and a pattern. And if you follow these steps, you'll have a good startup. And that's what most entrepreneurial frameworks are like. And that's what most entrepreneurial teaching is like. But you don't become Van Gogh by taking a paint by numbers class, right? And it's like, and you don't become Van Gogh just because you studied music, just because you studied color theory. You create breakthroughs by adopting a mindset, and it's like the stuff we were riffing on a little bit earlier about collecting the dots and connecting the dots and like engaging in lateral thinking and not just linear thinking. It's that mindset that takes you to breakthroughs. It's that openness to new experiences. It's the willing to try new combinations. It's the understanding of what the job description even is in the first place, which is kind of mixing this alchemy of inflections and insights and different dots that you collect from the future and the present and from your open experiences in life and different fields. It's like Steve Jobs taking a calligraphy class in college and then realizing that the Mac needed proportional typeface, right? And you would have never known that if you hadn't been awake in your calligraphy class. And so it's the mindset that I'm trying to help people talk about. And that can be taught, but it's like I resist any ideas that try to say, follow these 8 steps or these 3 things or these 5 things and you will get a breakthrough, because I just don't think it's true. I think even trying to solve for that is wrongheaded.
Mike, this has been fantastic, and I really appreciate your time. I always like to end with the same question. So what's next? I know that's big and open.
Yeah, the main thing I've been excited about, I hope this won't be a long-winded answer, but like when I was a kid, you had the era of mass computation and computing power became approaching free. And, as a result, the scarce resource was software. And you started to price things according to desktops. And you wanted a computer on every desk, every home. Then you had the era of mass connectivity starting in the 90s. And the goal was to connect everyone in the world. And the communications bandwidth was becoming asymptotically free. And software went from being a scarce resource to being open source. And now you had the value was accruing to people who created networks with the most nodes and connections and that captured the most attention. And I would argue that the smartphone was kind of an extension of that. And so now I think we're heading into an era of mass cognition. And so like what I like to ask myself is, in what world will certain types of cognition become asymptotically free? And how will that shift power dynamics? Like in the era of mass computation, power shifted from centralized hardware owners like IBM to distributed software like Microsoft. In the era of mass connectivity, it shifted to the people who were network operators who had the biggest networks of the most connected nodes and who gathered the most attention, and sometimes by subscription. How will people monetize the era of mass cognition? My instinct is it won't be the same way that the big companies of today monetize it. And my instinct is that an era of mass cognition will shift the balance of power in some very profound ways. And so that's what I'm really excited about, is getting a handle on this new sea change. If you had known that mass computation is going to create a power shift where software companies would be really valuable, you would have been much more awake to the possibility that Microsoft was going to be important. And because I had this kind of framing in the era of mass connectivity, I was much more awake to the possibility that Twitter could be something, or Twitch, or some of these network effects companies. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. I know that's a long-winded answer, but it's like, what types of cognition and answers are going to be free someday that cost a lot of money now? and how might, in those cases, cognition be unbundled in a way that it could create new powers and new startups.
I can't wait for it, and across every industry. Mike Maples,
Yep.
the new book is Pattern Breakers. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, and I'm honored that you reached out. I've had a chance to kind of equate myself with the show ever since, and you're doing a great job.
Thank you. So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.